One of the things you're going to be expected to do in comparative politics is to figure out how to compare countries to try to understand a little bit more about them. And that kind of begs the question, how do you compare? How do we actually engage in this process of comparison? And to kind of walk you through it, I want to actually use a real-world example. Let's talk about how would I try to explain why some nations have civil wars and other nations seem not. Now, there are a couple of different ways that I can do this. One way is something that we call a case study or a historical analysis. A historical analysis of a country is simply looking at one individual state, one individual country, and trying to walk through the cause and effect of its past. So if I wanted to explain civil wars, maybe I could look at the United States and figure out what was the process that led up to the American Civil War, what were the issues or the questions in the American Civil War, and try to learn about civil wars that way. The problem with the case study analysis is while you have lots of data and you can be fairly certain about cause and effect, you don't really know if what you learned in one country, say the United States, does anything to help you explain why there would be a civil war in a country like the Sudan or in Libya. So what we need is some method or some sets of methods for us to compare across different countries. We typically call some of these comparative qualitative analysis. We call them qualitative analysis because what we try to do, as with a case study, is engage in some type of thick descriptive discussion over the histories of the countries and then compare across them. A couple of different ways we could do that. One way is called the most different systems approach, or the different systems approach, or an apples to oranges comparison. So for example, if I was thinking about this question of why we have civil war, maybe I would look at very different countries and try to explain why two very different countries or three very different countries both had a civil war. So simply, rather than simply looking at the United States or Sudan, I compare the two and try to figure out why a very highly developed economic country in the 1800s had a civil war, as well as why a developing state in Africa would have a civil war, and see what factors they have in common. Another thing that I could do is have a similar systems or an apples to apples comparison. So instead of comparing countries like the Sudan and the US, maybe I should compare countries like Egypt, Libya, and Syria. In two of these countries, Libya and Syria, you had a civil war that resulted in the overthrow of the government, but Egypt you didn't. And this could be surprising. All three of these countries are in similar parts of the world. All three have the same basic religious structure. All three have similar tribal elements as part of their underlying culture. All three had dictatorships, and yet only two of the three had what we would consider to be a full-fledged civil war. So I can compare across these three countries and figure out what actually is in common, and that might give me some indication. Now, while qualitative analysis is very fascinating, and while a lot of people sort of enjoy reading it, what we find is that there are some issues with qualitative analysis. For example, with qualitative analysis, I can't actually compare large numbers of states. I'm only limited to maybe 2 or 3 or as many as 5. But at some point, my ability to think about problems and the number of factors is limited by my own mental capacity. So what became increasingly popular with the invention of computing is to use big data. Basically collect large data sets and look at a wide range of data and compare them across countries. After all, it may be that Egypt should have a civil war. It just hasn't happened yet. Right? So I have this big data option, doing what we would consider quantitative analysis. What became also popular in the late 90s, 2000s was something called rational choice theory. Remember in the previous lesson when we were talking about rational choice, we said that it may be possible to think about human behavior. Well, what rational choice does is simply try to model out or game out, given a set of incentives, how should the average person act, and where would I find these incentives? Now, I will warn you, as you're thinking about how to do comparison with the countries that you have or the countries that you're interested in, there are some inherent problems with the comparative process. They don't make it impossible, but they do make it difficult. So first of all, you have to be very careful with this question of time. There's this Latin phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which basically means before, therefore, because of. what we're tempted to say is simply because one thing precedes something else, that must have been what caused something else, and that isn't necessarily the case. So even if you have 2 or 3 countries that had similar events happen in their past, that doesn't mean the event actually caused it. There's an interesting discussion in a West Wing episode, and so if you click the link, then that will take you through. Another problem that we have is that often decision making happens behind closed doors. So if you think about something like the American Civil War, there has been this debate throughout our history: was the Civil War caused by slavery, or was slavery simply an excuse that was used by leadership? That really the causes of the Civil War happened behind the scenes as a result of economic negotiations. But what we saw visibly, the presence of slavery, the presence of some economic disputes, wasn't really the cause. So as you're thinking about how to compare states, be mindful of the comparative method. And next time we will talk about this question of the state and figure out what the state means so that comparison can be possible.